And for several weeks now, we've been considering the idea of God's call. Now, I must confess that I hadn't planned on that being the focus for the first 6 weeks of this calendar year. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that way last fall, I spent several days mapping out my preaching plan for the next year and decided that I would begin with a series that would focus on the manner in which you are being called to serve God and serve others. You see, I'd really like to be able to tell you that's what I did, but I can't because I didn't, so I won't. And I'm afraid I have to admit that it has just been more of a week-to-week thing, where it just seems as though the lectionary passages from Mark's Gospel are sending us in that direction. That doesn't mean that that's the only direction we could have chosen. Certainly any of these passages in Mark's first chapter could have led us somewhere else. But for whatever reason, these passages have taken me and therefore have taken us on this journey of exploring God's call in our lives. Now, you think that I would at least be able to tell you that the sermon titles for the last 2 weeks were planned out together. For last week it was The House and the Road, and this week The Rubber and the Road. Surely at least those two were planned together. But I'm afraid I have to tell you that they weren't. For I just happened to stumble upon that little poem that I used as the title for last week's message, and then last Sunday evening the title for today hit me, and at first I didn't even realize the connection between the two. Now, a few weeks ago, I told you that I have an aversion to pithy quotes and old sayings, and here I am, using one of those pithy quotes as the title of a sermon. For you know what someone means when they say something like, "This is where the rubber meets the road." Just in case you don't, or if you aren't sure of its meaning, here's the best that I could find from Word Wizard. It means when the time for decisions is now, a point where action is required, where ideas must face reality, where one must get down to the nitty-gritty, where the action is. Now, as we have talked about God's call, though, I'm afraid that what I have been offering you is little more than what sociologists would call glittering generalities. And I think you know what I'm talking about there. It's using words that sparkle and glitter, but in very vague and very general ways. And it's something that advertisers and politicians are remarkably adept at doing. But I'm not going to apologize for those glittering generalities, because I couldn't possibly begin to know where it is that God is calling you, and what God's specific plan for your life is, and what God would have you commit yourself to doing right now. See, in terms of God's call in your life, it is very hard for someone else to move beyond glittering generalities to get down to where the rubber meets the road. But maybe, just maybe, this passage at the end of Mark's first chapter can offer us some help. Maybe these closing words of this opening chapter that have taken us so far along in the ministry of Jesus can give us some substance, can give us some direction for discovering where the rubber meets the road in your own personal call from God. Now, when looking at this passage, I think we might at first be inclined to put ourselves in the role of the leper in this story. For we think of our own need for healing, our own need for cleansing. Or we think of times when we have been left out, times when we have been rejected or ostracized in much the same way that lepers were in biblical times. But I think it might be more profitable to place ourselves in the role of Jesus in this story. If we are trying to find the place where the rubber meets the road in our call from God. For his response to this man might put some solid practical substance and direction to the glittering generalities that we've been offering. Well, first of all, remember how our passage from last week ended. Remember, Jesus had gotten up very early and he left Peter's house. And when the disciples finally found him, he said, "Let's go somewhere else." And then Mark says, and he went throughout Galilee proclaiming the message. You see, Jesus is on the move. He's got something to do, and he is intent on doing it. And as we come to today's passage, there are a couple of things to notice, things that might help us determine where rubber meets the road in our own personal call from God. Now, first of all, there's a word that is used here that I think we have to explore in terms of the initial response of Jesus to this man. In verse 41, after the leper has approached Jesus and after he has issued his request to be made clean, how does Jesus respond? You know, it really depends upon the translation that you read. Now, most translations say that Jesus was filled with either pity or compassion. There's not really a lot of difference between those two. But there is a third word that may have been and probably was used here. But for the moment, let's stay with compassion. But you see, as Jesus left Capernaum, he was a man on a mission. But when he saw this leper, he was filled with compassion. And he put everything aside to respond to his need. And the question we are left with then is this: what would fill you with so much compassion that it would cause you to put everything aside to respond? Now just think about that for a moment. You think about it, because I don't know what the answer is for you. You just let it roll around in your mind for a moment. What situation would cause you to be so filled with compassion that nothing, absolutely nothing, would prevent you from responding? Because, you see, if you can come up with something, that is, perhaps for you, where the rubber meets the road. That's the call of God upon your life. I think there's something else that we can learn from the response of Jesus in this passage. The leper said, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus touched him and said, "I am willing." And what we have here is a blending of words and actions. Jesus said he was willing, and then he did it. You see, it really doesn't matter if it was the words or the action that came first. The point is, he combined his words and his actions together. He had a willingness to do something, and he did it. Now, suppose that Jesus, upon hearing the plea from this man, had said, "Yeah, sure, I'm willing," and then just turned around and walked away. His willingness would have been pretty shallow, wouldn't it? His actions would not have matched his words. And so too with you. Your willingness must be followed by accompanying action. It's not enough to say, I'm willing to do this or do that, unless you follow it up by actually doing it. Are you willing to act on that which fills you with compassion? There's one more thing that we have to address, and that's that other word that was perhaps used instead of compassion. I have to tell you that I really went back and forth as to whether or not to even address this sermon today, because I think it can be terribly misinterpreted, and it can be taken in a completely different direction from what it should be. Some early manuscripts of Mark read, Jesus was filled with not compassion or pity, but Jesus was filled with anger. That's right. Anger. Now, there may not be a lot of difference between pity and compassion, but there is a world of difference between either one of those and anger, isn't there? And we don't particularly like that reading, do we? We would much rather Jesus saw this man and was filled with compassion than with anger. And perhaps that's why the word somewhere along the line of translation and copying got changed. Now don't misunderstand, compassion still works, and it was quite possibly the word that was used. But what if it wasn't? What if Mark had indeed originally said that Jesus was filled with anger? Now, why and how can that be instructive for us as we consider where the rubber meets the road in our call from God? Now, I think there are a couple of possibilities to consider. Now remember, again, Jesus was on the move. He was a man on a mission. He had his eyes focused on the places he had to go and the things that he had to do. And this leper was interrupting him. This leper was standing in the way of what Jesus wanted to do and where Jesus wanted to go. And so perhaps, just perhaps, the human aspect of Jesus, in the instant that he saw this man and heard his plea, erupted inside and filled him with anger. You see, maybe he was upset at this man because he had intruded on his schedule and interrupted his plans. And can that not be tremendously instructive for us as we think about it? For we have things to do, we have places to go, we have a clear plan set before us for the way in which we think every one of our days is to be lived out. And the call of God upon us may feel like an intrusion and an interruption to those plans. Now maybe it's a call to a greater commitment to what you're already doing here at church. Maybe it's a call to give more time to our children or our youth or a board or a committee. Maybe it's a call to be more involved in a mission project. But whatever it is, whatever and wherever the rubber meets the road, you may find it to be an interruption. And you may find yourself filled with anger at that intrusion upon your life. So what is it then that we can learn from Jesus if in fact this was the cause of his anger? Now go back to what happened after his anger. He touched the man and said, I am willing. By his words and by his actions, he answered the call upon his life to help this man in need. So may it be for you. For those things that you perceive as interruptions upon your plans may be God's God's call in your life. But there is another way of looking at the word anger in this response of Jesus. You see, maybe he wasn't angry at the leper who had interrupted him. Maybe he wasn't angry, not at the man, not even at the disease with which he was afflicted. Now, maybe Jesus was angry at the man's rejection and ostracism. Maybe he was angry at a system that would cause this man to be made to feel less than whole. And as you look around you, what is it that makes you angry at the conditions you see? What is it that fills you with righteous indignation and a desire to do something about it? Perhaps that's the place that God is calling you. And again, I don't have the answer for you. I don't know what it is that God is calling you to do. But I do know this. I know that God is calling you. And it's really up to you to discover. As Word Wizard calls it, the point where action is required, where ideas must face reality, where one gets down to the nitty-gritty, where the action is. This, in effect, you have to discover in your own life and in your own call from God, where the rubber meets the road. Amen.